بسم الله الرحمن الرحيم الحمد لله رب العالمين اللهم صل على سيدنا محمد وعلى آل سيدنا محمد وبارك وسلم ربنا زدنا علما اللهم علمنا ما ينفعنا وانفعنا بما علمتنا وزدنا علما. So alhamdulillah, we're continuing with Sūrah al-Ḥashr, and in our past couple sessions on Sūrah al-Ḥashr we spoke about things that attract the mercy of Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala and that attract the fadl, the grace of Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala, and it brings down His madad, it brings down His help and victory. It's interesting that in Surah al-Hashr, Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala first mentions the victory, right, of the war booty that is gained by the Muslims while they are in the Madani stage. After that, Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala, in continuing the discussion of who this war booty is going to now be distributed to, Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala, after mentioning in general who is supposed to be distributed to, Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala mentions specifically two groups of people. And this is where Shaykh Amin's Tafsīr today really was centralized to, and it focused on these two groups of people. Is this beautiful structure of sultais that was given by the Muhajirun. That is what drew and it is what attracted the madad of Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala. So the fact that there's this the hope and the aqidah that Allah is the one who gives grace. يَبْتَغُونَ فَضْلًا. Right? So they were seeking that fadl min Allah. They were seeking that grace from Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala. So like Shaykh Amin said, you have to correct your aqidah first. We have to correct our aqidah first. And the Muhajirun radiyallahu anhum had their aqidah straight, that the fadl comes from Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala. And it was because of this that they migrated. And as a result of that migration, we now have these conquests. So you see that the impact of their mujahada, the impact of their aqidah, is that it serves as a mechanism and it serves as a force that now directs and it moves. Right? It moves this takwini system of Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala. Right? So you have this powerful move that's called the hijrah. Right? So there's this movement from Mecca to Medina, and this movement, as part of its effect, it sets into motion these conquests. So the rizq from Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala comes as a result of their aqidah. يَبْتَغُونَ فَضْلًا, right? That they had this fadl, they had this belief in the fadl of Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala, in His grace, in His ability to provide. Allah. Right? So they had this, they had that aqidah, and they had that certainty and conviction in Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala that He is the one who provides. Then the second group that is mentioned, and this group is a little bit below them, right, is the group of the Ansar.
Picture is weird.
Where is it going to? Could you perhaps maybe just play with the camera?
No, it's garbled.
Oh, subhanAllah.
Okay, as long as you're okay. I just wanted to be aware.
No, I wasn't aware of that.
Okay. I don't know how to show you.
I'll come there and check, inshallah.
nobody's complaining, maybe go without it.
Apologies for that. So then the second group that Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala he discusses is the Ansar. Right? And the Ansar, they had that description that of ithar, of giving preference to others over themselves, right? Even when they themselves were in need. Right? So وَيُؤْثِرُونَ عَلَى أَنفُسِهِمْ وَلَوْ كَانَ بِهِمْ خَصَاصَةٌ. And then Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala mentions this idea of shuh. Whoever protects themselves from shuh, then they are the ones who are successful. Okay. So Shaykh Amin was he alluded to this. He said that shuh is something that has many dimensions. Okay. And that's actually taken from hadith. It says, وَاتَّقُوا الشُّحْ, and be aware of shuh. فَإِنَّهُ أَهْلَكَ مَنْ كَانَ قَبْلَكُمْ, because it destroyed those that are before you. And then the hadith goes on that it was because of shuh that they spilled blood. It was because of shuh that they made things that were haram into halal. So shuh is an internal characteristic, and it has various external manifestations. Right? So stinginess, or withholding money or hoarding, that is an external manifestation of shuh. Right? Whereas internally, the shuh is something that's internal. Okay. So I want to connect this to something that Shaykh Amin he was mentioning towards the end of the tafsir. And that was that you have at the end of the dua that these Muslims, they make, is after they ask Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala to forgive them, to forgive those that preceded them in Iman, to forgive all Muslims in general, then they end this dua with رَبَّنَا إِنَّكَ رَؤُوفٌ رَحِيمٌ, that, oh Allah, you are kind and you are merciful. And one thing that Shaykh Amin mentioned over here is that Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala, he has the name of Ra'uf and he has the name of Rahim. And what we are supposed to do is we're supposed to bring that into our life. So every name of Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala has something that it demands from us. So if Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala is Ra'uf, and he has, as Shaykh Amin kind of translated as concerned, right? That he cares for the goodness and the wellness of others, then we should also do the same. And then if Allah has Rahmah, his mercy is inclusive, then our mercy should also be inclusive. So this is something that the ulama have always spoken about, and that kind of connects to what we've been talking about, this system of taqweed and tashri', right? Are you mimicking that system, right? So that when Allah's system has ra'fa, and it has kindness in it, and it has rahmah in it, then our system should also be one that is inclusive, that has rahmah, that has kindness in it. Okay. So getting our aqidah straight, we don't exclude anyone who is a Muslim from the rahmah of Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala. And so when we talk about how our systems should mimic, right, the system that Allah has put in place, then we have different systems. And the first system that we have is our theological system. Right? So at a theological standpoint, we don't exclude those who Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala includes. So Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala, although he's talking about the distribution of wealth, right, there is a greater paradigm here. And that paradigm, as Shaykh Amin was mentioning, is that in terms of virtue, right, you have the muhajirun first, and then you have the ansar. And then you have the rest of the Muslims that come after them. Right? So if Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala includes them in his fadl, right, Allah includes them in his grace, because they were seeking the grace of Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala. يَبْتَغُونَ فَضْلًا مِنَ اللَّهِ. So if Allah includes them, then we cannot claim to be Muslims while simultaneously excluding them from the mercy of Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala. Right? So there's this concept of when Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala has a name, then we are also supposed to act upon the dictates of that name. And we see that most beautifully, right, applied by the Prophet ﷺ, that he reached such an excellence regarding that even the Quran itself, and Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala in the Quran, he uses these same two names for the Prophet ﷺ. And so at the end of this dua, we say, رَبَّنَا إِنَّكَ رَؤُوفٌ رَحِيمٌ. Right? And when Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala describes the Prophet ﷺ, he says, لَقَدْ جَاءَكُمْ رَسُولٌ مِّنْ أَنفُسِكُمْ. Verily, a messenger has come to you from amongst you. عَزِيزٌ عَلَيْهِ مَا عَنِتُّمْ. What is difficult upon you is extremely difficult upon him. It's difficult for the Prophet ﷺ to see Muslims in difficulty. حَرِيصًا عَلَيْكُمْ. He is extremely concerned for your well-being. حَرِيصًا عَلَيْكُمْ. He wants all the goodness for you. بِالْمُؤْمِنِينَ رَؤُوفٌ رَحِيمٌ. Right? So he is Ra'uf, he is kind, and he is merciful with the believers. What I'm trying to point out is that the Prophet ﷺ, in his acting upon and his takhalluq bi akhlaqillah, him having these characteristics, he reached such a level of ihsan that Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala himself gives him the name Ra'uf and Rahim. And that's what Shaykh Amin was speaking about towards the end, that what will the job of Rasulullah sallallahu alaihi wasallam be in the akhirah? It will be this job of Ra'uf and Rahim, right? Of making sure that every last person that is destined to come out of the fire, that they enter Jannah. Until that job is not done, the job of the Prophet ﷺ is not done. So the Prophet ﷺ was not exclusive, right? He was not someone that excluded people from his job as, being being a manifestation of that mercy, right? وَمَا أَرْسَلْنَاكَ إِلَّا رَحْمَةً لِلْعَالَمِينَ. So even if we look at that his rahmah was not something that excluded people. It was always something that included people. So from there, with the Prophet ﷺ being our model, and also the names of Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala being our model, we first have to give the Sahaba their due right. Number one, theologically, by believing that they are the greatest. Right? And then from amongst the Sahaba, the Muhajirun are the greatest. And then after them, the Ansar are the greatest. So this is in terms of our theology. And being loyal to our theology, we cannot compromise by, trying to include those that would exclude the Sahaba radiallahu anhum. Okay? So when we say we have to be inclusive when it comes to the mercy of Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala, yes, we have to be inclusive to those who Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala says are deserving of His mercy. Right? Someone that breaks the fold and the pattern of what Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala describes, right? We have this linear, right? We can see that there's this connection that believers have to each other that transcends a timeline, right? And you see that in the dua, right? Where we make dua of maghfirah, forgiveness for us, those that preceded us, وَلِإِخْوَانِنَا الَّذِينَ سَبَقُونَا بِالْإِيمَانِ, and then in general for all believers, those that came before and those that are going to come after. Right? When we transcend this timeline, right? But this timeline is restricted to those that, they follow the theological standpoint of Ahlus Sunnah wal Jama'ah. Right? Of people that pay their respect to the Sahaba. Right? So now, as part of being loyal to that, Shaykh Amin was saying, we shouldn't, try to bend over backwards to try to accommodate people that don't want to accommodate the Sahaba radiallahu anhum. Right? So that's number one. And so we cannot show any empathy, or maybe empathy is not the best word over here, right? we can't be emotionally connected to people that disconnect themselves from the Sahaba. Because we are connected, and that's what the dua shows, right? So anyone that wants to disconnect themselves from this silsila, from this chain of believers, then they've disconnected from us, and we shouldn't, we don't need to emotionally connect with them. Right? And then continuing with this silsila, and this is what Shaykh Amin was taking this ayah and he was connecting it back to his previous point about planning, is that the ayah starts with وَالَّذِينَ جَاءُوا مِن بَعْدِهِمْ, and those that come after them. And then even in the end of the dua, وَلَا تَجْعَلْ فِي قُلُوبِنَا غِلًّا لِلَّذِينَ آمَنُوا, don't let there be any rancor in our heart regarding any believer, whether they came before or they're going to come after. So part of our rahmah and part of our mercy towards them is that we should plan for the future generations. Right? So one thing is that you have the theological perspective that we, in our mahabbah and in our love and in our association, we associate with anyone that is a Muslim. Right? That's at the theological standpoint. Right? Then you have it in terms of application. We don't socially connect and we don't socially mingle with people that disassociate themselves from the Sahaba. Right? And further, as part of our rahmah for the future generations, right, we plan for them the same way that Shaykh Amin was saying that Umar radiallahu anhu, he planned for the future generations by leaving that area in Iraq. As he said, I'm not going to distribute it. I'm going to leave it so that the future generations have some share in that land as well. Okay? And I'll end with this, inshallah, that we are talking about this, acting upon the names of Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala. Right? So if we go back to the beginning of the surah, right, sabbaha, right? So when we talk about sabbaha lillahi ma fi samawati wal ard, that everything does the tasbih of Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala, we have Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala's name, as-subuh, right? That He is the one who is pure, and He's pure from anything that is unbefitting of Him. Right? So now one way that we connect to that name, and this is what Al-Imam al-Ghazali rahimahullah, he mentions in his treatise on the names of Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala, al-Maqsad al-Asna, fi sharhi asma'illahi al-husna, he says that under this name of Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala, he mentions that a person has to purify their heart. Right? So just like Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala is pure from any attributes that are unbefitting, in the same way, a Muslim should purify their heart from anything that is unbefitting. Right? So that's what we see, like at the end of, in each of these qualities of the Muhajirun, you see that the Muhajirun, they had purified themselves from wanting anything from anyone. Right? Like Shaykh Amin was saying, they reached Medina without having any expectations from anyone. Right? They had purified themselves from the fear of poverty. Right? They had purified themselves from losing hope. They always had hope in Allah. يَبْتَغُونَ فَضْلًا مِنَ اللَّهِ. Shouldn't be pessimists. Right? So when we talk about lessons to take home, that we want to take lessons home from the Muhajirun, from the Ansar, it's all connected to this idea of purifying ourselves. And so we purify ourselves from being pessimistic. We purify ourselves from wanting things from others. And that's what we take for the Muhajirun. Right? And when we look at the Ansar, وَمَن يُوقَ شُحَّ نَفْسِهِ, those that are protected from that quality of shuh, right? The purification of the self. Right? So we purify ourselves from greed and stinginess. Right? And then at the end of the surah, at the end of the dua that comes in the next ayah, وَلَا تَجْعَلْ فِي قُلُوبِنَا غِلٍّ, we purify ourselves from having any negative feelings towards any believer. Right? So those are basically, if you want to summarize, then these are the things that, we want to purify ourselves from. Just like Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala is pure from any attributes that are anything that is unbefitting or any deficiencies, then similarly the believer should also be pure from these negative attributes. And that's what these ayat they really highlight. And when a believer, when a believer implements that, then you get this sense of rahmah amongst the believers. And now that's the beautification of the self after the purification. And so once the purification has taken place, now the believer is characterized and follows in, in applying those names of Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala, Al-Ra'uf and Al-Rahim. So inshallah, I'll stop here inshallah. And if there's any questions, discussions, we can take those inshallah. Sure.
Assalamu alaikum. I was wondering the hikmah of Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala sometimes tells us what dua to ask. Like as the example you said that make the dua for the people who came after you and for you too. Well, why does Allah tell us what dua to make when Allah is going to do it anyways, I guess? Like the Muslims are, they will get out of hell, inshallah, after, hopefully, whatever price needs to be paid or what have you. So I'm trying to understand. There's, I'm assuming it's a matter of teaching, trying to teach us something, I guess, from it. But it's just so interesting. Like, make those dua from me, and I will give it. Just give it.
Look, we can take that question, we can apply it to anything.
Okay.
So meaning, for example, Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala could have given any prophet their victory at any point. Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala could give the Muslims victory at any point.
Fair enough.
Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala, when He created the heavens and the earth, He didn't have to create the heavens and the earth in set amount of days. Okay? So the ulama, they speak about that, why. Okay? There's so many of these questions. For example, we'll take one example. Okay? Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala, many times, He speaks about the revelation of the Quran and the different phases that revelation goes through. Okay? It is there in the Lawh al-Mahfuz. And from the Lawh al-Mahfuz, it goes to the Sama al-Dunya. Then from the Sama al-Dunya, periodically over 23 years, it's sent down with Jibreel alayhi salam, who's identified as, the quwwatin 'inda dhil arshi makin, this angel of extreme might and power that is entrusted and has a rank by Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala. The question is very simple. Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala could have just inspired the wahi directly into the heart of the Prophet every time. That was one of the forms of wahi. Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala would inspire directly into the heart of the Prophet. So what's the purpose of, all these different stages? Okay? So to understand that, it really just goes back to our idea of why are these systems here in place anyway. We talked about the system of taqweed, we talked about the system of the sharia. Okay? It has to do with Allah's idea of perfection, right? This idea of perfection. Okay? So all of this world is here, and everything that exists, right, outside of Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala, other than Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala, right, the idea of it is to manifest the beauty of Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala and to manifest the perfection of His attributes. Okay? So the fact that we see this system and there's this gradual process that we see, our dua being a part of that gradual process, it shows perfection in planning. Right? It shows perfection in everything that's done. Right? أحسن كل شيء خلقه. That He perfects everything that He does. There's this level of itqan, there's this level of excellence. Right? And that excellence is put on display. Right? So your question isn't really just a question of why tell us what dua to make. It's really a question of why does this entire world and cosmos function in the way that it does? Why did Allah choose this mode of functioning? If you want to go all the way back, we've discussed this many times before. Allah could have just put the people of Jannah in Jannah and put the people of fire in fire. You didn't need this whole drama called the dunya, technically. Right? But this dunya is the madhab, right? Is the manifestation of Allah's adl, of His justice, of His rahmah, of His maghfirah. This is where you see that manifestation. I'm not sure if that answers your question.
It answered a more profound question, actually. But I think, like, of Allah, the best dua is that it's a sincere dua, right? But then Allah, the Prophet ﷺ gave us adhkar and du'as to make. But there are certain du'as that Allah is telling us to make this dua, right? Allah knows what's in our heart anyways. So the formality of saying certain words or dua must have a benefit other than just saying it your way. I mean, I understand for salah we're taught because there's a lot. I'm not comparing with salah, I'm comparing with some dua that you have to say. What would that benefit be of, hey, say these words and I will respond, versus if you say it in your own language, your own way?
Right. So this dua, it doesn't have to be made. There's, the scholars say you're following the sunnah when you say it in Arabic. Right? And a person takes the meaning of this dua like we did today and just says it in their own language. There's la haraj. There's nothing stopping one from doing that. Right? But in terms of why these particular words, right? Okay,
or why say this?
Yes. Yeah. It's really a guideline. It's a guideline for in this sense. Okay? I can't. One of my teachers once told me that a person's dua, that is, it's like a window into their soul. Right? It's what the person is, where they are in terms of their batin, in terms of their inner self. Okay? So the dua is really telling us that, okay, these are the words that you're supposed to be saying. And because you're supposed to be saying these words, what that means is your inner is supposed to be feeling that. Okay? Meaning your batin is supposed to, your internal self is supposed to come to that level where you organically make that dua. Okay? So, like when you read about, in the Rabbana ma khalaqta hadha batila, Allah, you didn't create this in vain. Right? A person's internal reflection is supposed to naturally elevate them to that level where they organically make that dua. So these ad'iyah that are ma'thura, or that are in ahadith, or they're in the Quran, what they're telling us is this is where you want to aspire to reach. So that you're not only saying it verbally, but internally you have this concern, right? So like Sheikh Amin was talking about the concern for Muslims. Okay, so now, one thing that is a person wakes up for tahajjud, and there's a whole lot of heart and emotion when they're making dua for themselves to be saved from Jahannam. Okay? And then at the end, we might make dua, we'll say like, oh, Allah, forgive all the Muslims too.
Yeah.
But if we feel that there's a difference of emotion when we're making dua for ourselves versus when we're making dua for others, that's telling us that, okay, we're mimicking the dua verbally, but internally we're not there yet, and there's still a ways to go.
Could it also be, by last time we had talked about being beware of the punishment on the whole, on everybody because of the actions of a few, and like I think we talked about last time. And then so by asking Allah for forgiving all the Muslims, they're actually being protected from that effect too, because He has forgiven the mistakes of the few.
That's definitely there.
Okay.
That's definitely an added benefit to it.
Okay.
Right?
So that would make it come out of the heart, is what I'm trying to say.
Yeah.
But even then, it's selfish.
Yeah, but the impetus for the true believer he's not just looking at themselves. It's honestly for the goodness of the other person. Let's stop here once again, inshallah, and perhaps we can continue again. Subhanallah bihamdihi, subhanakallah bihamdik, nashhadu an la ilaha illa anta, nastaghfiruka wa natubu ilayk.